Welcome back. Let's spend a few minutes and think about consumer surplus and how a decrease in price affects consumer surplus. So we should start out by just refreshing our memory. What is consumer surplus? So consumer surplus is just what a buyer is willing to pay minus what they actually pay. So their willingness to pay, we'll just call that WTP, minus the price that they pay. So that gets awfully jargony. What is the willingness to pay minus the price? This is just what I think of as the smile factor. Right? The buyer's smiling. Why? Because they're getting more than what they paid. Their willingness to pay minus price. All right, so let's set this up and look at it with a demand curve and think about, well, what happens if the price changes? So if we set up a demand curve, we won't put a supply curve in here just to keep our diagram a little simpler and cleaner. So the demand curve shows us the relationship between price and quantity. And let's throw in a price to start out. So we've got some initial price, I'll call it P naught, and Q naught. Now let's suppose that something causes the price to decrease. So maybe it's an improvement in production technology. So the supply curve increases, shifts to the right, and that does what? That causes price to decrease and quantity to increase. So if price decreases, so let's call this just P2, what happens? So we take that new price, we just trace over till it hits the demand curve, and now we can label in Q2. So notice that at a lower price, quantity has increased. So what's going on here? What happened to consumer surplus? And I'm sure you're thinking, oh, consumer surplus increases. Consumers are happy if prices decrease, so that just makes them smile more. Well, your intuition is right, but let's see if we can think about why. So to do that, let's label a few areas in our diagram. So let's call this top triangle A. Let's call the rectangle below it B. And let's call this other triangle, let's call that area C. So if we think about consumer surplus at the initial price, so consumer surplus at P naught, it was equal to A. And then price falls in the story that we told. So now we've got consumer surplus at P2, which is equal to A plus B plus C. So if we're looking at our difference, we see, well, A shows up in both of them. So what's the increase in consumer surplus from lower prices? Well, it's B and C. Right? This is our increase in consumer surplus. So the price falls and consumer surplus increases by area B and C. Why? All right, so what is area B? Let's think about it. So area B is this rectangle. What's the rectangle? Well, it's the decrease in price for the height. And what's the width of it? Well, it's over the Q naught, the original quantity. So area B is the gains in consumer surplus to the original purchasers. All right, so B, what is this? This is the additional consumer surplus for the original buyers. So the people who were going to buy at the higher price, they still buy at the lower price. They're just smiling even more. All right, so that's area B. But where does this additional gain, area C, come from? So what is C? Well, C is the consumer surplus. Consumer surplus for who? This is the consumer surplus for the additional buyers, for this increase in quantity because price decreased. So area C is the consumer surplus for the additional buyers. So what happens when price decreases? Consumer surplus increases. Why does it increase? Well, because our original buyers are smiling even more than they were before, and now we have some additional buyers who are smiling as well. So a decrease in price leads to a larger smile factor. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.